one told you life was gonna be this way. Your job's a joke, you broke, your love life's the old way. It's like you're always stuck in second gear. When it hasn't been your day, or week, or month, or even your year. But I'll be there for you.
Que pedo, way! Welcome back to the Mexican Revolution with your teacher, Mr. Diarmas. Today we're going to talk about Mexico under Porfirio Diaz. Last time we talked a little bit about the basics, what Mexico was like in the 19th century, for example. Mexico is still pretty, heard about the fact that America pretty much stole the northern half of Mexico, and the church controlled way too much. We discussed a bit about Benito Juarez. He made a lot of advances, democracy. He definitely got a lot of power away from the church. But unfortunately, and we will see a similar theme here, he manipulated what he could to stay in power for 5 terms. Not cool, but not the first or the last time. Now, we also learned about somebody who was the next president, Porfirio Diaz. He would be the country's tyrant, and he would be in power up until about 1911 when he was finally taken down politically. His reign of 35 years was filled with political stability and a healthy economy, but at the cost of exploiting the masses. Basically, he made the foreigners who invested in Mexico incredibly rich, alongside the elites and the científicos that were his closest confidants. Basically, in a nutshell, most Mexicans were suffering, whereas very few, the rich, had it all. So, let's pause real quick right here as you write down about agriculture. All right, so we're going to be splitting up today in a series of, the different ways in which Porfirio Diaz had upset the populace. And the first we got to talk about is the majority, which were farmers. So we got to talk about the agricultural woes. And in order to talk about this, we got to talk about specific laws, like the Terrenos Baldios law. This means bald terrain law. Basically, with this law, Diaz and his cronies were able to steal 120 million acres, by the way, in acres of football field, of land from the poor because he said they did not have deeds. Although these people had lived here for centuries, they did not have a deed. A deed is an official document that says you own the land. This land was given to people in the past when the Spanish had left, and they had just claimed the land because that's where they happened to be once their Spanish overlords had left. What did he do with the 120 million acres he stole? He gave it to foreigners, he gave it to bankers, and he turned large pieces of land into what we call haciendas. So what's an hacienda? Basically, think of it as a plantation system in which Mexican citizens were forced to work on the very land that was stolen from them. The land barons, the haciendados, would abuse the population. In what ways? Well, they'd pay the poor, citizens that had no deeds in scrip. Scrip is basically credit that only people on the land accept. It's like your own microcurrency. And things were purposely expensive to keep the poor people that were uneducated perpetually indebted so they would never get out of their situation. Think of it as being given Diarmas dollars that you could only spend in my classroom. That would be a lot of BS. Other problems, if you went on strike, they killed you. If you tried to take a day off because it was your saint's day, they killed you. And if you got hurt on the job, they didn't pay you any kind of money. These would be liberties that we would see in the United States and other Western powers in this time, but not in Mexico. Now, foreigners made a lot of money with this territory, and when they made the money, they used it to buy even more territory. So haciendas made the foreign owners or the small, rich elite in Mexico richer. They bought more territory from the poor citizens who could not compete with their small deeds or non-existent deeds, these huge plantations. So it was pretty bad for the average farmer, which was most of the population. Here we can see a very interesting cartoon. I don't know if you understand the old history, the 1,000-year-old history of the Aztecs and the Mayans in the Mexican territory, but here we can see it says, an offering a Porfirio Poxtli. The language of the Aztecs is very complicated. It's very hard to pronounce. So here we can see it's Porfirio Diaz. And the people are offering up their hearts and their souls to this dictator, Porfirio Diaz. That's how they were seen. That's how he was seen in his científicos. And here we can see that the darker shades here are those that were affected the most. One of the worst affected was a territory called Morelos. We're going to talk about that very soon. And a man named Zapata who freed the people of Morelos from this horrible, horrible use of bondage, basically. Here are some photos of the Mexicans working like slaves. You've seen similar images when we studied the Civil War. And here we can see an actual photograph of a hacienda with the peasants working the land, people forcing them to work, and if they didn't work, well, they were beaten. Let's watch this video. It's a bit longer on the haciendas and life there. You're going to notice some people talking about it and being interviewed. These are historians that really understand the revolution and its roots.
Y en este caso, Porfirio Díaz está como muy claro de que para él México tiene que ser moderno, México tiene que ser un país de avanzada. Y por eso su lema de orden, paz y progreso. Ya está toda la industrialización y viene todo lo de la luz eléctrica y empieza todo lo de esta modernidad de las urbes. Por otra parte, tenemos a todo este pueblo indígena, este pueblo campesino, que está marginado, que no se le atiende, en donde se va a encontrar el descontento.
Porfirio Diaz was a strong ruler, and he held Mexico together with the help of the military, of hacendados, and with American backing. The unrest was there because of the nature of that economy and the society of that time. Rural Mexico was poor. The hacienda system was a tragedy for Mexico.
The haciendas were large estates. Some originated from Spanish land grants, while others were made up of lands the owners had bought or stolen. They were nearly totally self-sufficient enterprises that up until the Revolution functioned in a semi-feudal system. The haciendas generated much of the wealth of the country, but most of it stayed in the hands of a few. The owner, called an hacendado, had nearly total power over the peones, the people who worked the land. The southern state of Morelos was home to some of the richest haciendas in all of Mexico. Many of them were sugar plantations, long known for horrendous conditions. After centuries of abuse, Morelos was ripe for a rebellion.
Un día en Cocoyoc, ahí en esa calle donde vivo, cuando un español, indio, ¿qué hace? Así con ese parado orgulloso, ¿qué haces, indio? El indio se agacha, usted lo ve, señor, porque ya sabía que la opresión era grande. Por eso, los que nos lanzamos a la revolución en defensa de la patria, no fue una valentía, un orgullo, una necesidad. Que querían que trabajáramos a punta de ciudadanos por 25 centavos, amaneciendo hasta Metesol. Andaban los alcapazaces en las calles, que no hubiera ninguno en su casa sentado ni acostado, menos, y lo veían, vamos para afuera, ni permiso pedían los alcapazaces. A punta de chicotazo, vamos a cargarse la calle, a cortar calle, por 25 centavitos. Centavitos, no pesos, como ahora. ¿Y quién iba a aguantar eso? Dígame, ¿quién va a aguantar eso? Luego resultó la revolución.
Okay. Wow, right? I mean, they were completely exploited. Let's pause right here. All right, now, here we can see a discussion on the other industries that were also affected. First, let's begin with mining and textiles. Mining, they had similarities. Mining, that would be getting silver and gold from the land, and textiles. They were both dominated by Europeans in the United States. And in both industries, there were very poor working conditions. Guess who was the group that had to do the harder jobs? Of course, the Mexicans, the digging and the hauling, for example, in mining. And they were paid in silver, whereas the foreigners who'd come in and to be the managers, the Mexicans, they were paid in gold. An ironic situation would happen. these mines had been open for centuries before. The old Mexican managers actually had to train the new foreigners that were coming in just so they would get their job taken away from them, and the new foreigners would be paid better, given more food, given better housing, and given actual Medicare. Whereas the Mexican manager that was working there would be just now one of the many, people basically in indentured servitude. Now, if you tried to strike, you were faced with either Porfirio Diaz troops shooting at you, or even worse, a foreign country would say that, your strike is causing me economic damage, and they would bring their own army, the British army, the American army would come in, and then they would shoot you. And Porfirio Diaz allowed this pacification by foreign powers that we will see later in this series of lectures other countries will fight hard against. The railway industry, again, bought by the elites and the foreigners. But most importantly, now that it exists, this railway industry that was non-existent before Porfirio Diaz, he could get his army anywhere in the countryside. Moreover, the land that he owned, and the few people in Mexico owned most of the land, if it was near a railroad, its value increased a lot. And because there were railroads all across Mexico, all industries increased. Now we could get the oil, we could get the textiles, everything from different parts, and get them to ports to ship them off to other countries. So the railway industry was necessary for it to become a modern country, but it also helped out the federal government much so they can get its army anywhere. Finally, the oil industry. They traded a 50-year oil contract to Great Britain to basically build the infrastructure. In a sense, they said, Great Britain, you can have our oil for 50 years, you can make all the money off of us, just build the infrastructure so that after 50 years, we get it. This will be important much later when we finish this course. Mexico, in the future, during World War II, especially in World War I, would be a leading oil exporter. There's a lot of oil in the Gulf, and they would take advantage of that and be able to modernize because of that. So the oil industry is important, although it exploited the people. So here we can see an old railroad in Mexico. It was all owned by the Europeans and the Americans. And here we can see all the different areas that had plata, which is oro, gold, plata, silver, mercury, coal, carbon, copper, and all these are the mines that were basically purchased by the Americans and the Europeans and had the poor Mexicans working in them. And here we can see the railway, the famous railway that was bought and paid for by the Europeans and was able to get the soldiers around easily. This will be very important for the revolution. Eventually, those that are fighting against the government are going to take over the northern line. And here we can see all the oil wells which were owned by Great Britain and the United States. Now here we can see the economic history in this period of time, and here we can see the 1890s to 1905. This is the Porfiriato. We can see that it definitely improves a lot in this time. So it was good for the economy but bad for the people. Now, one last video for today before our final slide on the industry and what it was like, a bit longer but informative.
In the late Porfiriato, Americans had huge stakes in Mexico. The beginnings of petroleum, mining especially. The railroads were built by Americans. Many Americans owned land in Mexico. These were economic interests, and the Americans wanted to protect these interests.
American investments in Mexico were enormous in the early part of the 20th century. Some authorities say they were greater in value than all of the investments in property owned by Mexicans in Mexico.
While this close relationship with the U.S. benefits the científicos, Diaz is keenly aware that it places Mexico in a precarious and potentially dangerous position.
The Mexican government of Diaz was very much afraid of American influence. So wherever they could, they attempted to favor European interests.
In 1908, Howard Taft is elected the 27th President of the U.S. One of his main goals is to implement what he calls dollar diplomacy, his version of economic development in Latin America.
Unfortunately, the Howard Taft administration was incredibly ignorant of Latin America in general, and Mexico specifically in this case. His knowledge of Mexico came from his advisors who were interested in Mexico and in Latin America only for the purposes of generating profits for American companies.
storm clouds begin to gather as a worldwide financial crisis causes skyrocketing interest rates. Farmers in northern Mexico go broke. Across the country, many are hungry. Among the hardest hit are the miners who often face intolerable working conditions. The abuse in the mines leads to strikes, and the strikes to violence.
The first of those strikes happened in northern Mexico in a copper mining town called Cananea, which is about 50 miles south of the Arizona border. The copper miners were both Mexican workers and US workers. And the strike broke out partly because Mexican workers wanted equal wages as the US counterparts, who were generally earning twice as much money. The thing that really grabbed the headlines in Mexico was the intervention of about 250 Arizona Rangers. There were about 20 to 30 workers killed during the strike. And this caused really major outrage in the rest of Mexico, because it implied that Porfirio Diaz couldn't control domestic affairs.
Strikes break out all over the country, at textile mills, tobacco factories, and railroad yards. In the cities, professionals complain they are being shut out from government jobs. There's discontent among landowners and businessmen as they watch the científicos prosper at their expense. Perhaps Diaz has been in charge long enough.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video. You learned a bit about why people are so upset, whether it was the industry or the farmers. Let's kind of sum it all up now. Pause to write this down. Alright, so to advance Mexico, Diaz basically controlled the people. Remember, his científicos controlled everything, the judiciary, the politics. If you were a dissident, a person that was hating on his government, you were jailed or you were forced to leave. You couldn't vote for local officials. He picked them. So you didn't have a governor or a mayor of your city that listened to you. Nope, it was all him. And even the middle class got a bit upset because they couldn't compete with this big money foreigners coming in and stealing all the industry. Eventually, like any economy, Mexico couldn't keep this path going up for long, and once the economy began hurting and demand fell for Mexican products, it reverberated into the people having to work more, the conditions getting worse, more people getting laid off to save and cut costs, more unemployment, food prices going up, and this explosion right here basically made it ripe for revolution. Let's remind ourselves why people revolted, why people would risk their lives, why 2 million people would be killed in the process. First and foremost, the conditions of work were terrible. All the resources were being extracted and being sent to Europe and the United States for their own wars, for their own issues. It was basically resource extraction from this poor, uneducated class. The foreigners controlled all the wealth. Nobody had any voice in politics. It was all the Porfiriato. It was all Porfirio Diaz. The natives were being paid half of what Americans and Europeans that were coming in would work because they were being paid in silver instead of gold. They even had to train their own replacements. Of course, worst of all, after these issues with the Catholic Church in the 19th century, now the Catholic Church was in support of all this, and food prices were going up, goods were going up, they couldn't afford it, the unemployment was high. All of this made it very easy to have a revolution, and it would begin, and we'll see it begin in the next series of lectures. So here we can see one of the many factories in Mexico, the women sewing in a textile factory. Imagine this, for 12 hours a day, Saturdays included, no holidays off. It was a horrible, horrible life. And here we can see the long-run economic development. This little blip down right here, this little blip down is when it really hits the fan in 1910, 1911. This little downward turn is the reason why people got so upset. And one final cartoon for today, you can see progress is along the way, but the Mexicans have a long way to go. So, America, unfortunately, we would do very little. We gringos, as they call us, would watch 1.3 million Mexicans kill themselves, hoping and hurting for a better age. Here you can see Uncle Sam looking as the Mexicans kill themselves as revolutionary after revolutionary comes into power. So yeah, hopefully you've learned a lot today. You understand why the Mexicans were so upset, whether it was the farmers or the people working in the mining fields, the textiles, railroads, oil, whatever. And we're going to learn next time about the first challenger to Porfirio Diaz. His name is Francisco Madero. Thanks for listening and good luck.